and it's theater, and the place where they both meet.
We have the audience and participants for each other.
Intellectual practice, historical practice,
Examples of women
sharing what it is that you do, sharing how you do that.
There's no way you can ignore that path anymore.
We're from all around, you can come and see and talk about.
You start to have a little thing, you write it in, and that will bring completely forthcoming.
Theater for everybody, yes, everybody.
That's just what should be done.
And indeed, my understanding of life, relationships, death, have already changed.
The survival of theater as an art form depends on that.
But there's room for it all. There's room for it all.
So thank you everybody for coming here to the Martin-Thies Segal Theatre Center at the Greater Center CUNY. I see many familiar faces, so I feel slightly guilty to show you our propaganda video, but there are some new guests in the room, and we are proud of what we do here. And someone once told me, if you don't praise yourself, no one ever will. So I think we put this out to communicate a little bit what we are doing. My name is Frank Hentschker. I'm the director of the Segal Center, and we do bridge academia and professional theater, international and American theater for over a decade here at the Greater Center CUNY. And tonight is a very special evening for us. It is the second evening with Hans-Thies Lehmann, who came all the way from Germany via South America and Yale to us. And it's also a special personal connection. I was a student of Hans-Thies Lehmann at the now legendary Giessen Institut, where lots of people say it was the most unlucky academy for the traditional German theater ever. It destroyed what used to be the good theater, and we are very proud of it. And we showed for 2 days a collection of theater artists whose work fell in the realm of post-dramatic theater, and many connections. The Rimini Protocol, She Pop, Gob Squad, René Polish. So much has come out of that Giessen school, where Andrzej Wirth together with Hans-Thies Lehmann as a dynamic duo created something completely unusual. It's the most influential theater school, most probably in Germany, definitely, perhaps in Europe, that really has redefined a field. And Hans-Thies is here tonight with us to talk about his new work on tragedy, a book he wrote also for a very long time. And he will tell us a bit more about the pre-traumatic that inspired him to do that. And with us are some colleagues and friends and fellow travelers on the road, on the Theaterwissenschaften, and we have Jonathan Kalb here with us, and Elinor, Brandon, Andy. So thank you really all for coming and being here with us. It's a very extraordinary evening, I think, to have Hans-Thies with us, and I hope you also will enjoy it. Last night, I think, was a very special moment. Some of the students said this was the best discussion they ever had heard here at the Segal Center, so that is a good thing. And we are proud that this is even possible and thinkable, but it was, so if you have a cell phone, please now take it out, and let's make sure it doesn't ring. And it should be off on mute. The evening should not last longer than 90 minutes. The format will be Hans-Thies will give us some reflections, and we have 3 sets of speakers, which is all printed here. And then we have a Q&A and a little reception afterwards. So again, thank you all for coming. And I would like to ask Hans-Thies Lehmann, who is here with us, to come to the stage.
Okay.
Is it on? Yes, that's always.
It's very good.
That's always good if we have sound already. So again, Hans-Thies, thank you for coming, and also for being back with us this evening on tragedy. So tell us about the work. Everybody was wondering what the next book would be after the post-dramatic theater So
Yes. And of course, my editor always wanted me to continue to write post-dramatic theater too.
Yeah.
What is happening since then? Of course, I refused, because I think that should do somebody for whom the theater after that was his primary experience, as this was for me. So I had a different take on this, and I wondered at one point, as Elinor Fuchs talked to me and asked me, what's post-dramatic theater post to? And I said, yes, of course, dramatic theater. But what exactly is dramatic theater? So I started a book on dramatic theater, but also I wanted to do it on tragedy, to focus it on in one way or another. And so I had to think of something, how to present this. And this thinking, the volume got bigger and bigger. Too big now for a reader. But I think it is nevertheless worthwhile.
So what did you discover while researching or rethinking tragedy?
First of all, I've discovered that there's practically no theory of tragedy which takes into account theater. It's all based on the text analysis. And I wanted to get back to that factor, because reading a tragedy is, of course, an interesting experience. But to experience a tragedy in theater is actually the thing that is important for us, in theater studies at least. So I tried to find a theoretical perspective on that. And so I got to think of the notion and category of experience. I think that today in theater, it's not so important what's on the stage, but what is experienced by the spectators. Because theater is a situation, essentially. So I started to think of this specific kind of experience. And then the next thing, of course, I didn't discover, but that was clear, that the word tragic is used in so many ways, so many, you might say, so many degrees of precision, that you have to think what you want to say when you say tragic. There's, of course, a big tradition of tragedy theory, which says it is about a conflict. Tragedy is about the conflict of equally important values. And but if you have this notion of tragedy, there are already two dangers connected to it. The first danger is the intellectualizing of the thing, that you think of tragedy as a conflict in ways which philosophy could debate more clearly than theater could ever. And the second is, of course, that it is very close to a dramatic idea. There's, however, another line, not so dominant in the tradition of thinking about tragedy, which is going back perhaps to the ancient notion of hubris, the transgression of your limits. And this is something I find more interesting to think of as a tragic idea. And so I studied a lot and found out about Georges Bataille and Nietzsche and this line of thinking. So I think today it's interesting to think of tragedy as some kind of a transgression. Of course, tragic transgression is often only fake. That is why many people today in the theater, they try to break the rules in the frame of theater when they do it. Because if you go to the theater, you experience nothing but a self-affirmation of your values and the consensus with a nice audience about what is good, what is bad. You have never a tragic experience, which is about tearing apart something in you. So I found Judith Butler the nice idea of our cultural intelligibility, which is shaken by tragedy. So this brought me to this concept of tragedy as an experience of transgression, which at one point in history started to take a dramatic form in the Renaissance, essentially. And this is over today. No, I think more or less. We can certainly debate about the question, why is that today? Why is that over today? And if I think of tragic theatre today, I think of performance artists, for example, people like Jan Fabre, or Castellucci. Or on the other hand, of people who demand of us a degree of patience, listening and being open that we are not used to. So transgression must not necessarily mean always transgression of moral or so laws, but often, of course, it is.
You also worked as a dramaturg, right, on Fabre's Mount Olympus?
Yes, I was happy enough because I met Fabre already in the 80s when he was in Theater am Turm. And I got him to talk to the students in our seminars. That was great experience for them. And then I followed his work. He was, of course, much criticized all the time through epigone of cliché and everything. But I think he's an artist who's an admirable consequence, has done his work over the decades now. And when he invited me to collaborate a little bit on Mount Olympus, I was very happy. This is really a sort of transgression of a theatrical scale, of course, because Mount Olympus is a 24-hour performance. 24 hours performance. Imagine that for the performers and for the audience.
In your research on the tragic, what surprised you most?
What surprised me? That's an interesting question. I never thought of it. I think it may be that tragic is such something so simple that you are easily missing it. When you see, for example, the chorus of Agamemnon, the old men there, the beginning of the Oresteia, our basic trilogy of ancient tragedy. What is it about? About old men who are sorry, they can't fight for their country. Or it is about women who are losing their children. It is something like a point where human fragility is being shown. And especially the heroes. It was perhaps the most surprising insight I had, not now, but already when I worked on Untitled Tragedy. That the hero is never shown as a victorious one, like our Hercules films also. But the hero is always shown when he's struck down completely. So tragedy is a culture of defeat, you might say. And this, I think, is very important, because also for all revolutionary art, the idea of defeat is, of course, essential, because when somebody starts a revolution against the dominating class or group or so, they are by definition, he's fighting the more powerful in the world. So he's looking straight to defeat when he's doing it. This was something that was very important for Brecht, who always thought that it is important for us, for everyone who tries to change something in society, to think of the possible defeat that he's facing, not on the victorious side. Yes, that was perhaps a kind of surprise at the time.
I remember that Heiner Müller remarked after the fall of the wall, he said, I'm not sure if I can go on writing tragedy, perhaps was connected to a dictatorship or to a repressive government. He said, what is now in West Berlin or the neo-capitalist society, you have to write comedies. What do you think of that?
Well, Heiner Müller said a lot of things that are always very, very interesting to think about, but not always totally to agree. I think he had in mind, in fact, that art is not taken serious by our people, also our government, and so it was taken serious in the GDR, of course. So I think Heiner Müller, he said, at the same time, there's only one thing I believe in, that's conflict. That's the only thing I believe in is conflict. And he also said, when he was accused of historical pessimism, he liked to answer, I don't know what you want, I'm a historical optimist. I believe there will be a fourth world war. He was optimistic enough, of course, to assume that somebody would survive Third World War to start the fourth one.
Speaking on tragedy, you were also a student of Sondi, right? And how was his influence? He was perhaps as influential as your book was to next generation. Can you tell us a bit about his work and your relation to him?
Yeah, Peter Sondi was probably the most important influence on my academic life in general. He came to Berlin. I at once started to study with him. Unfortunately, in 1971, he took his life. And I had just started a dissertation with him. I had only written one chapter. It was about Brecht and Arthur Rimbaud. And I had only written a large chapter on Brecht and on the Brecht Ophelia motive from Rimbaud. And he was an incredible teacher. He was very generous in his outlook because he invited to Berlin for us La Coulabart in Nancy. He invited Derrida. He invited Samuel Weber. He was then at the Institut and taught us Lacan, while there was nothing in the whole German situation comparable to that. So he was a great influence, and his way of teaching was very much to bring you to question your own thinking all the time. I would always say when you discuss the text of yours, so he would say, when you say that, then you presuppose that this kind of simple logic was very strong. And he was never a normal professor. That was exactly the point. He was at some times secretary of the Academy of Arts. And his seminars and his teaching went to you as a kind of position you take to the truth-finding process of science, of theory. Of course, there was this book, Theory of Modern Drama, which was essential for my reading, because Sondi developed the notion of the abstract idea of drama. And that was a model where you could really make distinctions in the development of modern dramatic writing.
Speaking of writing, maybe that is a way to segue into our first panel. Of course, you know, you mentioned, I think yesterday, Jelinek, also writers of theater, but in a way, Fabre and Castellucci are, you know, writing through or thinking through also through the action. But still, the question is, and it has come also up in the discussion last night, you know, on writing in general and the significance of it. So we have with us Elinor Fuchs tonight, who was so inspirational for Hans-Thies and for his work on tragedy, and Jonathan Kalb. So thank you both for coming, and maybe I would like to ask you to join, and we have another chair here. We will have a microphone for each of you, and I'll sit here. No, that's fine. I'll just take that. Oh, there, it's okay. So maybe first, Elinor, when it comes to writing post-dramatic theater and your thinking, what is the connection to Hans-Thies and his work?
Is this working?
Yeah.
I was here.
You have to hold it close. You have to hold it close. Sorry.
I have to hold it close. I was here last night and noticed that other people on the panel had prepared some remarks. So I went home and I prepared some remarks. Please forgive me for reading them. I decided not to ask our esteemed organizer whether he intended writing to mean critical writing, dramatic writing, or post-dramatic writing, or even pre-dramatic writing, because if I didn't ask, then I would be free to choose my own approach. I will confess that at the 2010 conference in, many people informally say HTL, and please know that when I say HTL, you know whom I mean here, that the conference in HTL's honor on the 10th anniversary of the publication of Postdramatic Theatre, this was in Belgrade, and we are almost up to the 20th anniversary now. I first met HTL there, and somewhat trembling as I was about to give a paper on the persistence of the fictive cosmos. And you who have read Postdramatic Theatre know that one of its great contributions is that Postdramatic Theatre gets rid of the fictive cosmos. Well, we already know that it had been already dead for 10 years. But at that conference, I did hear HTL wonder out loud whether he should have said more about post-dramatic writing for the stage. But Never mind, as a close theater friend of mine likes to exclaim, this did not really mean that HTL was suffering from doubt, but that he was generously willing to consider everyone's point of view as potentially valid, which is the only explanation I can offer for my having left that conference with a new BFF. You know what a BFF? A best friend forever. You're not young enough, right? A new best friend. So I followed up on this with a visit to him in Berlin a few years later, and it was true. He offered me tea. So never mind this seeming doubt about the text. It really meant not discussing playwriting more meant, or came to mean to me, his refusal to privilege the kind of dramatic criticism that puts the dramatic text at the pinnacle of dramatic or even theatrical significance. An error that he traces back to Aristotle, and that he quietly disavows even in the work of his great mentor, Peter Zandi. And he didn't want to isolate this way of making meaning through the text, through the dramatic text, because it would seem to diminish other ways of making meaning in the theater. And this is one of the great contributions that he makes, and it continues in the book on tragedy. As he writes in his introduction to his Tragedy and Dramatic Theater book, theater may no longer be equated with the dramatic paradigm that dominated Europe between the Renaissance and the emergence of the historical avant-gardes. It is this development that has fully revealed the difference and even the contradiction between drama and theater. He speaks there of the vast expanse of possibilities for deriving meaning from, and then he names the sequence of scenes, from body language, from rhythm, from relations among space, bodies, sound, light, movement, etc. All these factors combine to form what he calls the reality of the theater, in which, and now I'll say Hans-Thies also includes what he elsewhere calls the theater situation. And it took me a while to really understand it, which says that this is something of which I've not taken sufficient acknowledgement in my own work. Many of us were, and still are, raised on theater as drama, that is, theater as dialogic writing, and entire graduate programs and publishing ventures are staked on this fundamental separation of drama and theater. Hans-Thies wants to close that gap, to scramble the priorities, and he scolds Aristotle for putting opsis at the very bottom of his carefully ordered elements, and you know that plot and character come first. Well, then, all that one needs to know of theater could be derived from reading. The very word post-dramatic, which has circled the globe like a forest fire, snapping up all the structures that it surrounds, could almost be called post-writing, because it goes beyond the agreement of Brecht and Artaud that there would be no more masterpieces. And he asserts that the historical period of the dialogue, of the dialogic theater, which lasted for a couple of centuries, is really over. Dialogue may still be useful now. It's like one of the things the theater can reach for, like lighting, but it's not the prime maker of meaning, I think you mean to say. I admit to being of a transitional generation. I hate to see Shakespeare snapped up in the conflagration. I know that even a good actor, much less a great actor, could make me understand without any words at all that he sees a dagger before him. But I ask you a question. Once you have dropped the prologue and the epilogue, all these things that Shakespeare dropped, and the monologue, and even the aside, which is still twitching with life. You see, I just proved it. And you've already dispensed with the chorus. Once you've done all that house cleaning and swept out the pre-dramatic leftovers, Once you've done that, where does Shakespeare stand now? You know, that's a question that I think many people are left asking, especially your Anglo-American audience. I do like to say that you German folks tended to discover Shakespeare, you know, when Mendelssohn was playing around on the piano a couple of centuries later than we did. So, and it was after that the Germans, I think, gave up their flirtation with French theater. But the Anglo-Americans were always championing they took sides in the battle of the ancients and the moderns, and they claimed that they were the moderns. So I end with this question now for you. Where do you now place Shakespeare?
That's a wonderful question.
It's a wonderful question. Well, thank you.
Yes. Because every time I come in teaching to Shakespeare, I tell the students, and now to something which is the absolute exception from everything. Don't think that you can understand it by saying it's a Renaissance or that's something, because Shakespeare is such a phenomenon that I feel envious a bit as a German. This is your tradition and not mine. However, German romantics discovered Shakespeare. And since then, Shakespeare has been discovered, has been considered in Germany actually as a part of German tradition, in a way. Many Germans think that English people are not really capable to understand their Shakespeare. And of course, this Shakespeare is a good example for us in Germany to show to people when you study it how superficial often the idea is that you know something. The people seem to know what is Shakespeare, and then they grab the translation and read it to you. That's an author who certainly has a lot of similarities with Shakespeare, but is a completely different author than the real Shakespeare is. So Shakespeare is, for me, a point of no return everywhere. I think that he is one where you could, like Brecht is another one, you could study the whole history of theater and all the aspects of theater, only studying this author in depth. And I think what you just mentioned works in this work as an addition. It's adding up. There's a medieval aspect that you can see in Richard III, the old iniquity of the morality plays. Then you have the romanticism, which you can find in Romeo and Juliet. Then you have the historical aspects. You have the cynical analysis of power. You have the parody of tragedy, revenge. Revenge tragedy, I mean. All this comes together in his work.
So, speaking, of writing on the caliber, on the magnitude of Shakespeare, Beckett and Müller come, of course, also to mind, and Jonathan. Even so, I think most people took notes last night while the evening was going on. So I don't think anybody prepared so beautifully as Elinor just did. But maybe you have studied so long, also Müller and Beckett. Where do you see the correlations of the post-dramatic, Hans-Thies' work, and where do they stand as writers now
I will answer that question, but let me just say that I was not here last night and did not prepare remarks. I will do the best I can extempore. I have known Thies for more than 30 years. When I was a Fulbright student in the mid-1980s, I went to Giessen on the invitation of Andrzej Wirth and gave a lecture on Samuel Beckett. And I met Thies and I met Genia Schultz, his former wife, who had written a wonderful book with some chapters by Hans-Thies Lehmann about Heiner Müller. I finished that book on Beckett and was looking for another subject while living in Germany, and Heiner Müller seemed to me by far the most important subject to choose after that, and I began my work on Müller, which ended up being my next book. In the meantime, I came back to Frankfurt and invited myself to stay at their house, which I recognize in retrospect was a little cheeky, but I wanted to know them. Because I didn't know what Frank meant when he said on writing in this panel. I thought we were going to talk about your writing. And I just think that one of the things that maybe a scholarly audience does not understand is what a beautiful writer Hans-Thies Lehmann is. The way I was introduced to him was in his essays on Heiner Müller in journals like Merkur, which kind of like an American quarterly are not interested in a lot of footnotes and a lot of esoterica or even dense theory. And so it was the clarity and the insight of Lehmann's voice that first drew me to him, as well as feeling as though he was the one who made more sense about Heiner Müller than anybody else who was looking into this very complicated author. So I feel as though there was, for me, an immersion in Hans-Thies's work. At the same time, there was an immersion in Heiner Müller. When I read Postdramatic Theatre, I read it first in German before there was an English translation. Like the tragedy book, it's a much longer book in German than it is in English. I think it is evident in the English translation that the guiding lights are Heiner Müller and Samuel Beckett. But I don't think it is as clear. There is a section of Postdramatic Theatre on Beckett's play That Time, which is, to me, a culminating discussion. It's a discussion that points out that this work by Samuel Beckett is as much a pinnacle in a trajectory toward the postdramatic as Bildbeschreibung, or description of a picture, is in the work of Heiner Müller. Why that section was cut out of the English translation, I will never understand. Maybe you will tell me. But there were a lot of ruthless decisions made. In any case, there was a necessary thinking project that I had to engage in figuring out what Heiner Müller's artistic essence was, that had to do with joining Brecht and Beckett. Why this follower of Bertolt Brecht, Heiner Müller, would find that he had, in order to move forward in his own work, to come to terms with Beckett's work, an artist who had been demonized in communist Eastern Europe, why he had to come to terms with the end time scenarios, the emptying out of the dramatic circumstance, the use of the dramatic event as itself a metaphorical activity. This is not obvious, and it took a lot of thinking and a lot of pestering Heiner Müller to work this out. But the one book that was most helpful to me was Postdramatic Theatre. So I don't know if anybody has said this in this set of panels, but has anyone said thank you for everything that you have written and that you've given us? I hope so. If not, I'll say it.
Yeah, it's of course very touching to hear. And of course it's true. Heiner Müller was for me a guideline, in theory as in practice. His way of thinking about theater was for me essential, not only his work as an object of study. He had the complete lack of illusion, complete lack of, making things any way better than they are. And at the same time, he had so much fun and humor, wit in it.
Although I didn't prepare anything, I happen to have been carrying with me something that has a quote that might bring this full circle. Tony Kushner wrote a beautiful essay as an introduction to Heiner Müller collection. And he says, I just have this quote here, it's a coincidence. It ties together with something that you were saying with Frank earlier. Americans are famously hope addicts, frantic for a fix to stave off the despair which, repressed, threatens always an explosive, destructive return. Heiner Müller says one must learn to live without hope or despair.
That's one of his quotes, of course. He took it from Seneca, but he was really like that. He said it on many occasions. This was his ideal of living, without hope and without despair, because he was too smart about the box of Pandora to think that hope was something good for the people. Because, hope is one of the evils that holds the Pandora box. Because hope makes people desire, it makes them gierig. Is gier.
Thirsty for
power, for money, and so he said, I'm neither a hope nor a dope dealer. Neither hope nor a dope dealer. And I think this is, for art, is important, that we don't try in the theater to do something which we don't believe in. But most theater I see, especially in America, I must say often, is exactly like this. They put something on stage which nobody can really believe in. The world is so beautiful, it's so nice. And this is a compensation. And this is not my idea of art. It wasn't that of Heiner Müller, it's not that of Jonas. So I don't think of Elinor, of any of us, Frank.
That's true. Maybe that also would be a good moment to come to our next panel. And I thank you for joining us and coming, for preparing. I would like to ask Andy Goldberg to come. Oh, this, okay. You want to keep your notes, of course. They will be published. Of course, we had two other names on the program. One is Marvin Carlson, and when I emailed Marvin, say, see you tomorrow, he said, I'm still in Cairo, so he mixed up weeks. But as you know, he has been a wonderful friend and supporter of the Segal Center, and he got a very big theater award from a festival, and I think he decided to stay longer to accept the award. And Carol Martin emailed this afternoon. She came down with a terrible flu, and she said, I can't really speak, so her voice is affected, and she sends all her best, all her greetings, and was really looking forward to the discussion, perhaps, of that, of her field also, which she co-created on the intervention or the invasion of the real on stage. But we have Andy Goldberg, luckily, here with us, who is here in the PhD program. And first, building up on Jonathan's Tony Kushner quote, you practice theater, you study theater, you're going to teach theater. As an American, how does the post-dramatic fit in for you? Very often people say it didn't really permeate, it didn't get through the glass ceiling, eggshell, or through the walls, the fourth wall. So tell me a bit.
Is that on? Sorry, yeah. So yes, thanks for having me today, Frank and Hans-Thies. So I was going to talk a little bit today as a teacher who uses these concepts of post-dramatic theater and theater of the real in the classroom, and then also a little bit as an artist and how they inspired me. And I think, particularly in academia, the term post-dramatic theater or theater of the real become familiar very quickly. They're sort of common currency, and we just sort of use these terms, but actually you kind of can forget the paradox of something like theater of the real or the provocation of post-dramatic theater, and that these terms are actually, especially when you first hear them, quite shocking. Theater of the real, theater as a representational space, and real, that which is beyond representation. So it's a provocation, it's a paradox. And as a teacher of undergraduates, I'm luckily reminded at the beginning of every semester just how shocking these terms are, because they're always met with massive amounts of resistance, particularly at a place like NYU where they're all actors or studying acting, introducing these terms post-dramatic, that there's a difference between drama and theater, and that where we might be past drama is very anxiety-producing to people who are spending $70,000 a year to learn how to act in dramatic text, for instance. And then I show them shows with robots and that they'll be outsourced soon. And then I show them theater of the real, where we don't need actors, we actually bring real people on instead of representing real people, and that gives them, then they're ready to quit. But eventually, what I hope to show when I teach these texts are that for me as an artist, I found the idea of post-dramatic incredibly liberating. You know, I was a Shakespearean director, a dramatic, very traditional director in that sense, and the other night you talked about how the theory came after the practice, that you sort of recognized what artists were doing, and that the term came from the artists. But it also, for me, works the other way, that the theory, the idea of post-dramatic, it was like the chains were released and suddenly I was free to create theater that wasn't bound to certain aesthetic rules, and I found it incredibly generative and inspiring as an artist. And so the theory kind of in a feedback loop was revelatory. and likewise theater of the real. So after directing very standard plays, I've now started working with real people. And what was been most interesting and surprising to me is that post-dramatic theater is in some ways theater that measures itself by its distance from dramatic theater. But as an artist, I found that I was using all of my tools as a theater artist, as a dramatic theater artist, just in new ways and in new combinations, and that it's really about how interconnected a dramatic and post-dramatic practice are. We're not sort of leaving anything behind. You've just sort of opened up the field, and for me personally, the term has made the world a bigger place. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very lucky. I'm very happy that you used the word liberating there, because this is what I intended, and this is what I have the feeling sometimes happened with the book, not only in Europe and America, but also elsewhere, that people studied it and read it, and it was for them kind of liberating force to find out about their own traditions beyond or below the dramatic. And also the fact that you said that you could use all your dramatic expertise in post-dramatic theater production is true. Let's think of Rimini Protocol, for example. This complete theater, even without role impersonating. Everything is there, there's a space. There are people who share with you their experience. There's also concentrated speech and listening. So everything that is part of theater is there.
Speaking of the theater of the real, did you foresee that wave in a way, the Rimini Protocol or the Gob Squad? Was it a surprise for you, or where do you see it fits in that work that perhaps should be tragic or comedic to reflect this idea? But the theater of the real, the experts from the streets and the audiences are this in the center.
I had more provocative aspect of the relation between theater and real. The book that was on Fabre, where you always have this undecidability if this is real or fake. What's happening? People stepping on frogs, and then you believe it's real. Or is it? You don't know exactly. And even somebody is treated by electric shocks, and you don't know if it's real or not. And I always thought that's interesting in theater. If you cannot decide this, that's fascinating. Much more than that is that something real is coming in. It's much more interesting if you don't know where the limit is, because this is bringing your spectatorship in question. Because however you decide about your own ways of spectator to behave to that.
Do you think it is also an influence of television, kind of the reality TV shows, or do you think it's a separate, independent development that happened within the world of performance and theater?
It is always difficult to say, because there's always fashion. At the same time, there are real movements going on. I think that people in the theater had developed already a hunger for not just representation, but the real. When there came this wave of reality shows, And in a way, the theater of the real is more an answer to that. The rejection of that kind of cynical exploitation of your curiosity about the reality of people. It's not a follow-up to it.
And thinking about the term theater of the real, I've been thinking about the way, on the one hand, it can mean about an importation of sort of documentary theater techniques where you sort of bring the Rimini Protocol style, the experts of the everyday, and that's sort of one strand of theater to the real. But then to mention somebody like Jan Fabre or Mount Olympus, that's a very different kind of real that's coming in. But do you think this kind of the real that tries to kind of push the aesthetic frame to a kind of durational length is related to the real of the documentary theater, or are these different strands, or do you think they're both asking a similar question?
That would be an interesting subject of study. I don't know.
Postdramatic Theatre 2, your sequel?
No. I mean, within the frame of postdramatic, you can ask, of course, if this strand is related to that, historically, practically, and in terms of influence, or even structurally. And I think we should start before we compare these kinds of intrusion of the real to make clear again what we are meaning when we speak of real. Because le réel in Lacan does make something completely different from the reality. And in theater, I think we always have several layers of reality which are built in this art form from itself, from its structure. For example, you have a sculpture, you have a painting, portrait, then you have nothing of the human presence in the sculpture or in the painting. But in theater, you have the fictive identity of a person, let's say Hamlet, and then at the same time you have the actor, who's not aesthetic, who's just as he is, even if he is chosen for certain reasons. So theater was never completely artistic. It was never completely an aesthetic phenomenon. So it's a life phenomenon of reality. So that's where we start with this discussion. And then is reality not just that this person is really, let's say, a private detective and not playing one? Is that so important for the reality? Or we have the realism debates in literature. Perhaps the real is more about the relations of people in the society. In this case, you can have theater completely without the break with the real. At the same time, it brings you something about the reality of life. So there you get a kind of very faceted questioning. I wouldn't even try now to make this distinction clear within a few sentences.
No, for sure it is. As Eckermann or Goethe would say to Eckermann, it's in weites Feld. It is a big field, and it really is worth, I think, to examine what the Hamlet's mirror, means or always meant, in that to question of theater, what's real, what's not real. in any cases, whether it's a Marivaux or whether it is a documentary piece on expert. It is something. We once had the great puppeteer here from the Handspring Company, Basil Jones, who said why he loves the puppets. He did the Wojciech and the Truth Commission. And he said, complex issues, like the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. You can't paint it. It's hard to describe, but you have two humans moving a puppet, but the puppet seems real, but the humans are in the background. You don't see them, but you know they are real. They are moving. The most complex issues, subconsciously somehow, will be able, in the confusion it creates. What's real, what's not? Light goes out, people pretending, somebody else. That opens the mind. That is actually one of the very, very few things where a perception of what might be real is happening, because you step out of it and then are open to something. But thank you so much, Andy, for coming in. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. And I think we, of course, miss Marvin and Carol, but we touched a bit on these universes, and they really all need exploration. I wish we would have a half-year-long seminar here, so to go through it, and maybe we should actually. But I would like to ask Brandon to come and join us. And we've talked a little about it. How does the work of Hans-Thies Lehmann, or the idea of the Giessen Institut, which has been so influential, will it really be able to have a strong reception in the US? Will it be possible to do it? And you have been a wanderer also between the two worlds, between Berlin and Fischer-Lichter's Institute of the interweaving cultures, which is also a wonderful term, I think, whatever they did there. But the idea is great. So. Seeing those two worlds, being in there, what are your thoughts, and how will they infiltrate the reality of the theatrical representation in the US? Will it be sleeper cells that all of a sudden people will like, Andy will come up and change something, or will it be resistant here?
As Jonathan said before, I guess I'll answer that question eventually, maybe, or not at all. But I also wanted to just echo Jonathan as well with a lot of gratitude toward Hans-Thies, without being sentimental. Oh, sorry. I guess maybe I'm a second or third generation Lehmannian by now, but it's hard to sort of really take seriously what an influence your work has had really on my whole career so far as an artist and as a scholar. And I guess 10 or 11 years ago, as a graduate student at Berkeley, I convinced the UC to wrangle some money, and we invited Hans-Thies and Helena out to Berkeley, and we got to spend a week together in California. And not long after that, I moved to Berlin, which was supposed to be for a year, and it was 10 before I left, and was just always a guest of their gracious reception in their house, and have had the privilege, really, to work on 3 different book projects in many ways that are informed or directly about post-dramatic theater. So really, so much of my time has been spent thinking about this, and in many ways trying to push the idea in my own work to think more toward what Elinor brought up before about expanding this notion of the theater situation, right? And thinking about post-dramatic theater as not only a set of aesthetic proclivities or priorities, but also the different types of institutional frameworks that it facilitates, demands, requires. And so, what are the ways in which it, is both a transgressive, perhaps, set of aesthetic goals, but what kinds of perhaps transgressive institutional frameworks does it require in different sorts of circumstances? So now, being back in America, I have this weird job, and then I have this privilege of getting to run this very, very small 2-person theater program at NYU. And so I've been thinking a lot about institutional formation and the way in which this work, or thinking about what can we learn from Hans-Thies also as an institutional thinker. And so I guess I wanted to answer your question, Frank, with a question for Hans-Thies in a way, which is that, I think a lot about, I think it was, I don't know if it was you or you citing Heiner Müller maybe 10 years ago when you said to me, you know, it's not about making political theater, it's about making theater politically. And I think about that a lot. And I think about the term angewandte Theaterwissenschaft, or applied theater, and what that means in a US context, what gets taught under the rubric of applied theater, namely, you know, very, let's say, sort of agitprop oriented, or very secure in its politics, right? A particular type of community-based practice, a leftist activist practice, questions about theater and therapy. And so we talked about Giessen a bit last night, and about Frankfurt also, but since we have the two of you here who spent a whole bunch of time in Giessen, I guess what I would love to ask about really is how do we understand the institutional possibilities, or the pedagogical possibilities? What kind of pedagogical impulses did you bring to Giessen, right? And what did that look like in thinking about training a generation of theater makers? What were the priorities? What did the seminars look like? I think number of students in here, and in this context, it feels like this is something that doesn't get talked about that often, but it seems to me that there's an intimate relationship between the theory that comes out later and the pedagogical practice. And so I guess that's a question that I've been wanting to ask you for a long time, so I hope this was a good opportunity to do it.
It certainly is. We started with opening the structure of pedagogy in two ways. There was a very general introduction into theater studies, and then we had seminars on very specific subjects, also theory subjects. We would do something. Let's say we would read a Deleuze text, a Bataille text, or something of the sort, and you read with morally refined students a text on the notion of dépense, of, gasping. What is dépense in English?
Interconnection, or
No, the sacrificing, giving too much generosity and so on. And if you read this text, the students, they protest and say, no, we have to save everything to give it to the poor or something. But I would say our society is impossible to make generous gestures any longer. We don't give away. And so this incapacity of giving away is killing our society in the long run. Comes back as destructive, destroying coffee or so because of the world market and so.
So, Brendan, did you monitor on U.S. universities? Do you feel there is a strong engagement with post-dramatic theater from your colleagues or from your generation? And
it feels to me like it gets read in most programs. I guess as a teacher, I find that it's that text that you assign, and the students come in and their eyes are blown wide open, right? And being at NYU, as Andy said, where there really is this interest in the dramatization of everyday life, and as Hans-Thies said last week at a lecture at NYU, and I think this is very clear. So there is this real risk about what are the ways in which this kind of theater form is a real affront to bourgeois life. In certain ways, or at least the expectations that one comes to a professional theater program if one wants to be an actor or director and come out and get an agent. So, you know, I like to think of it's weird to mobilize the text in this way, right? But as the text, you know, is going to freak them out, and so I always feel really really grateful for that, right? That it becomes this eye-opening moment for the students. But you know, in the art world in New York, I find it read a lot less than at the university, right? And I do find myself, having come back from Berlin, feeling very much like an alien in many ways, for a number of the reasons Hans-Thies laid out earlier, right, about when discussing Heiner Müller. Because there does seem to be, you know, I'll go into a room or I'll pitch an idea to someone and I'll say, yeah, you know, we're just going to strand the audience in the lobby for like an hour and 15 minutes and see what happens, you know, and theater that somehow, you know, that is in any way risks antagonism, right, or risks uncertainty in a way that might lead to not some kind of being wrapped up in a bow in a certain sense, but that has the possibility that people might leave angry or people might feel like they're not getting their money's worth out of the ticket. You know, I tend to hand them the book and say there's a long tradition for why this isn't such a crazy idea.
As a roadmap. Maybe as a final question to Hans-Thies before we open it up. Of course, you have followed German theater over decades. It's been very successful. German movies or sculptures or painting are not perhaps as leading, but German theater at the moment is truly enjoying a great representation and something. They have something to say. Last night you said we try to teach students in Giessen not how to be successful, but to find out what they have to say. And so in a way, German theater in the moment does have something to say. Now when Ms. Merkel's, you know, chancellorship coming to an end with all the changes, refugee crisis, what are your observations about German theater at the moment? Closing of the Volksbühne, where do you think it might go, or just as a general comment for us?
I would start by saying what should be there.
Okay.
This comes back to the question of pedagogy, because sometimes I'm asked, why did you do with the students, let's say Hegel, although Hegel is philosophically surpassed, simply because Hegel is a demand on thinking and on art as a kind of saying the truth, like philosophy, like science. Art is research. Art is research in the possibilities of human being to express what it experiences. And I feel that this is essential, that if you think of theater just as an entertainment practice which you can learn, I'm not interested in that at all. It's only when it's coming to the truth, to your truth, of course, not a metaphysical truth someplace else. And I think that German theater, more or less throughout the last generation of people, there's always been a strong line of social responsibility of the people in the theater, and that they see theater as a possibility of, you know, laboratory of social imagination, as Heiner Müller liked to say too. Not just an entertainment practice. I think this is the main problem today for you teaching in the States. I would hear it. That is what I said now is probably sounding like an alien from another star. But if you look at all these wonderful museums you have in in New York, all these painters, all these artists over the centuries, why are they still there? Because every one of them was trying to say a truth, thinking in colors, or in sculpting. So I think that theater is two things. It's a time of affect, which is beyond theory. At the same time, it's a space of common thinking, where you gather with people to do some thinking together. And I think this is what theater can be today, to fulfill its task, that it demands this of itself and of the spectators alike, that we think together.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Maybe let's have some light on the audience and you know, the Hans-Thies' idea also is to focus on the theater as a situation or an atmosphere, also to create an atmosphere. That's some, yeah. So let's start with Jonathan. Maybe you take the microphone. Not only we hear you better, but it's also recorded and streamed.
When I got to the end of your tragedy book and saw you thinking about tragedy and the post-dramatic theater, it occurred to me that maybe this was one life work, the post-dramatic theater and the tragedy book. And I started thinking about my own ideas about that, and I thought, I would love to ask him that. In what sense for you are these two monumental projects one life work?
The two monumental projects.
You mean if they are connected as one?
Yes, it seems as though the tragedy book was a continuation. Continuation. The tragedy book was in some sense a continuation of the thinking in post-dramatic theater. Is there a sense in which they are one project?
Yes, they are. It is. It started even earlier, 1991, when I wrote about ancient tragedy. And in ancient tragedy I defined there as pre-dramatic, post-dramatic and dramatic. It is a suggestion to read our theater history also in a different way from what we do now. There's a common project, you're right. And I hope it will continue even. I'm now trying to kind of separate the theoretical aspects a little bit from the examples and write a little philosophical text about theater in general as the next project. So that is in fact, it is one project.
Right. Thank you. Another comment or question from the audience?
Hello. These 2 days were absolutely wonderful. So thank you for that, and thank you, of course, for the book. Who had a powerful influence in many countries, and I wonder why in the countries behind the Iron Curtain, why do you think the post-dramatic theater it doesn't have such a great impact? Not your theory, but on stage. Do you think there's a connection, in other words, between globalization in Europe and the influence of post-dramatic theater, the circulation of that? Because in these countries, text-based theater is still much more powerful, and you have fewer examples from that part of the world in the book.
Yes. Heiner Müller wasn't played in the GDR. He was nearly at the edge of being forbidden. Brecht always was suspicious in GDR. You know, he didn't
GDR
go.
means East Germany. Yeah.
East Germany. And you know, he didn't go there to East Berlin after when he returned from exile without having secured that he had a citizenship of Austria, so he could travel, that he had publishing rights in West Germany and Surkamp, so he could publish, and that he had his money in Swiss account, so they couldn't take away his money. That was his relation with the socialist state of East Germany. And I know in Russia it's very similar. There is practically no Heiner Müller. Of course, no Beckett. Translations are there, but very few, and the traditions are different in the political interest of the powers there against this kind of practice. I think this is the reason. However, when I had the chance to experience the presentation of a Russian translation of Postdramatic Theatre, which was, you know, initiated by Vassiliev, it was a great moment for me, because there were hundreds of young theatre people very anxious to think about this and to know about this more. And the few books they had were at once sold out. So I think there's ideological, political, and also traditional reasons that there's so little reception.
One second, yeah.
Thank you. So ironically, I think I will just contradict you, and it's kind of funny how this is going to become like the Eastern European battle. But it's funny because I was kind of debating whether I should say something or not say something, because when I think, Brendan, you were talking about like the importance of the academic center in Giessen and what it meant for Europe at a certain moment. And funnily enough, I got a fellow, I'm from Hungary originally, and I got a scholarship in Marburg. And I just remember going to Giessen all the time because that was the place to be. And I really thought how, I went back to Budapest, and that's something that Hungarians tend to do, is that we kind of steal templates and then we don't reference the origins. And I really thought that we had a theater studies program that really, like we really took what you established in Giessen and we made that happen in Budapest. And I didn't even know that that was actually happening. I had to come to New York to learn that was what was happening in Budapest. So that's one thing that I just wanted to acknowledge and kind of thank you for that. But the other thing is that I am wondering, like, so I think I understand what you're saying, but I do think that there is a strong influence of post-dramatic theater, definitely in the Balkans. I think it's so much there. I do think it's present in Hungary. I very much say so. And I would also say Poland. But I don't want to speak for the Polish theater. So to some extent, I do want to ask you if you'd agree.
Yeah, we all think it is present, but I think the question was on the stages, perhaps, or on the main stages. If you see main companies like Remini Protocol, Goldberg, or others, to work in Münchner Kammerspiel, the Burgtheater, or others, so that perhaps is not fully there. But I think the idea of what you said, it's about liberation. And if theater is interesting, it is interesting because it's a model for something. Something can happen on stage. It could happen in life. And the works are really, really challenging structures. They really are against structures, replacing them with completely different models. And yes, I'm sure there's things that make people uneasy. Heiner Müller used to say that theater itself is actually the enemy. That it represents the machine he was against. You have to always know, if you do theater, that you do something in the machine, against the machine, instead of pleasing. And so I think, yeah, there is some strong, very, very strong political measure, not as political theater, but as a theater that is political.
I certainly have simplified a lot, because I know, of course, there are the translations, and in Poland also they invited, for example, Rimini Protocol to do a project there, in Warsaw, I think. But that's always a question of some people.
I think I was responding more to the observation that it's not present in East, like behind the Iron Curtain.
But maybe we'll go to some other questions or comments. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in about Eastern Europe and specifically about the context of Russia and Belarus, where the most politically charged theater is, I think, post-dramatic. So Teatr Dok in Moscow, right? It's a theater that only has 100 seats, and yet it's being taken by guards in black masks and dogs and guns, precisely because they're doing not Chekhov. They're doing this very what I would call post-dramatic, and the Belarus Free Theater is absolutely influenced by post-dramatics. I think it's happening in the underground, but these theaters then move globally. So they produce at La Mama, so they have a global presence, even if they're being oppressed in their home states.
Thank you, that's very interesting.
Another question or comment? No. Rachel.
I don't want to continue too much this conversation, but there is an underground movement, of course, of different theater practices. But as Frank said, it's not on main stages, never. And it's, I'm coming from Romania, and we translated into Romanian post-dramatic theater in 2009, and it had a great impact on this underground movement, not on the official stages. That's the difference.
Well, maybe it also will take some time. The Giessen school was the mid-'80s till they got successful. It took 20 years. But maybe also as a closing remark, maybe say just about your writing, what your philosophical ideas. So what the next project, maybe give us some early ideas so we here at the Segal can say we knew that first or we heard it first. What are you thinking about?
I'm thinking that there are a number of ideas which you could fit together to teach today to students a theater of thinking which is not void of feeling. And one of the ideas is, certainly I was mentioning yesterday, the telling of a joke as a model of aesthetic communication.
Oops.
Yes. I don't know if some of you were not here yesterday, so I will tell it again. If you tell somebody a joke, and you have finished the joke, and he looks at you like this, and says, I understood the joke, then something went wrong. Because in telling a joke, just as in aesthetic communication, it is not about the understanding, but about something else. The laughter, in the one case, or the aesthetic feeling in the other. So the dimension of understanding has a different function in theater than it has in other contexts. It's only a necessary step, sometimes necessary step, to some other communication, which depends on the situation. And I would like to refer this back to our American friend, Richard Schechner, who developed the notion of performance text very early. Where he explains that for a performance it's not only important what's happening on stage, not even what is happening between audience and stage, but where it happens, when, under what conditions, in what institutional frameworks, if it's at night or if you go there at noon, if you're taken there by a bus or if you don't go there. And if you take these notions a bit further, you come to the concept of situation, and from that to the communication. And there's a wonderful film of Jacques Lacan in a lecture where he says to the students, la communication, ça fait rire. His meaning, la communication was of course the catchword of the day. That's ridiculous, because there's never such a thing as simple communication. But on the other hand, it's the same way. He also says that true communication is not about exchanging symbolic action, but it is about something like the laughter, common laughter, about a joke. This is one of the points.
Yeah, wonderful. And the act of sharing, you know, the joke between.
The act of sharing it.
The act of sharing it. And I think we really would like to thank you for sharing your thoughts. And again, thank you from everybody in New York and from people here around the world for the contribution you have made, and for taking the time to be here with us for 2 full evenings, and also for you. Thank you all for coming, the panelists, of course, but also the audience and our viewers online. So I think this is quite an insight, and perhaps we will type up the notes, and I think they are very profound and significant, and sometimes one needs to speak it out, but then have to read it again, what one said, and to capture the full meaning. So again, thank you for coming, and I think we all big applause for Hans-Thies Lehmann and for coming.